guys, it's 7:30 or 8:30. My clock is still set on Texas time. So I'll go ahead and dive in if you don't mind. I don't know if you enjoyed the music we were listening to, the beautiful cello. That is actually from a video game called Journey, which we will be talking about later. But yeah, no, it's one of the greatest soundtracks. It has won a number of awards within and without the video game world. So, on that note, we're not just going to talk about video games today, but we are going to talk about video games today. If you know me, I lead a video game cover band. That is the degree to which I am a nerd. So that is going to color some of what we're talking about here, but I'm hoping to bring in some of your experience and expertise as well. This is going to be largely a discussion based. Basically, I'm going to rant at you, and then we're going to talk about it. Are we on board with that? Yeah. Okay, excellent. Okay, so Jim Kelly told me to pick a controversial subject to get you guys in line. He suggested why it's more important to play video games than to read classic literature. I don't entirely agree with that, but it does seem to have gotten some people sitting here. But the main title is actually what the main push of my presentation is going to be. So I figure you guys can read. I'm going to try not to read my slides to you. If I do that, just kick me. You can kick me, you're close enough. But yeah, so moving right into it. Oh, here, I'll give, hello. I'll give people a little bit of time. I started on time, so no worries. All right, so why did I choose to present this? So for my third semester project, I don't know if you guys know, I'm usually a magic realism writer, but my thesis is a work of cyberpunk science fiction, which I love but had never really written before. But in talking to people about my sentient androids, when I said robots, depending on what they were familiar with, what their pop culture references were, they pictured something completely different. Some people pictured C-3PO or R2-D2, some people thought about Mega Man. It really depended. Sometimes people thought of Data from the Next Generation. So I decided to write a paper exploring these robot stories and these tropes and really digging academically into why we write the tropes we do. And I found that most of the robot stories I found, I could easily fit them into one of 5 categories. You'll notice I'm not presenting on those 5 categories. I like the topic. I don't know whether you guys would like the topic. This, I think, is going to be a bit more relevant and interesting. But as I was citing these robot stories, I found myself time and time again going not to prose fiction, but to the other sorts of stories that we tell. To movies, television shows, video games, comic books, that sort of thing. And I was citing these, and I was having to look up how to MLA format a video game citation, and there isn't a consensus on that yet. But I think there will be, because there was conversation. And I think that as academia begins to accept these more and more, I think that we as writers maybe will want to do the same for our sources of inspiration. So that's the why here. So let's talk about our own biases. Who here plays video games? Who here really doesn't like video games? Okay, good. I've got somebody to argue with. This is perfect. Who here reads comic books? Who here really doesn't like comic books? Okay, that's fair. So we've all got biases. I would say who here doesn't like movies? Anybody doesn't like movies? Anybody here doesn't like television? I actually don't watch much television myself, so the rest of you guys are going to have to fill in our television examples because I'm kind of going off of what other people say here. But okay, so I think having biases against something usually comes from stereotyping it rather than really understanding it. And I think that if you give something a chance, you might find that whatever problems you have with it maybe apply to part of it, but not all of it, and so that you may be cutting yourself off from something you'd love. So how do we fight those biases? So let's take the easy baby steps to get there. Again, this is good. I've got people I can argue with. I can try to convince you guys, because some of you are going to be on board with this already. So here's something that I think we can all agree on. Writers should be well read within fiction or within poetry. And there are a lot of reasons why you should read. These are three reasons that I have picked. These are the 3 reasons we're running with. Otherwise, we'll be here all day. So learning by example, looking at things that are done well or done poorly, and learning from either one of those. I think we can probably all agree that even if you read a really bad book and you say, that was really bad, you can kind of learn from that. If you read something that's really good except for that one thing, you can be like, how could I do that thing better? So in either way, or in either case, it's beneficial. Expanding your writing vocabulary or toolbox, if there's something in particular you don't know how to do, like say you've always kind of wanted to write something in first-person present tense and you read a book that is written in first-person present tense, you can kind of learn how to do that and add that to what you can do. And then understanding what's been done before and avoiding cliches. I think, especially for those of us who write genre fiction, there are a lot of cliches, and there's a lot of things that have been invented before. Like, for example, Ursula K. Le Guin invented the Ansible, which is faster than light communication. Since then, science fiction writers can just put an Ansible in what they're writing and assume that their readers will be familiar with that. Maybe not so much, maybe it's been enough time since then. But that kind of lets people save time, and that also means that if a young writer invents this great new idea and it turns out that it was invented sometime before, that can kind of be a little awkward. So if you're well-read within your genre, then you kind of avoid that awkwardness, and everybody is happier. So here's a little bit further, but I think most people here will probably still agree that writers should read poetry, or prose writers should read poetry, and poets should probably read prose fiction. And even though what they do is not directly comparable to what we do, we're all using words, and we're using words in different ways. And I like to think I'm working toward having a lyrical voice. And what better way to look at a lyrical use of language than poets? And some of their techniques that don't necessarily come up in fiction, but can strengthen the quality of your prose. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that poets could maybe learn something if they want to do structure from us. I don't know. I don't write poetry. I'm really bad at it. I started trying to write lyrics, and boy, do I have appreciation for people who can do rhyme and rhythm and meter. But you can kind of work some of that into your writing. So I think most of us are comfortable with this idea. Okay. So then we're going to go to the things that maybe we're a little less comfortable with. This is where the presentation picks up. What if we look outside of literature and literary works for inspiration? And so what do I mean by that? As I said earlier, movies, comic books, television shows, video games, there are other mediums out there. These are the ones I'm talking about. You might be more comfortable if we talk about film, or if we talk about graphic novels, which are comic books, but they're comic books in a certain format. And I think it's really interesting, the connotation of these different terms. The language that you use has power on how people perceive the format, even if it is the same format. So we're kind of going to talk about that a bit. So this makes some of us a bit uncomfortable. And so why is that? I think that, I don't know, I think that if you're here, you're probably not completely opposed to this idea, at least in some cases, so hopefully I'll win you over for the rest. So this is going to be a bit easier for those of us in pop fic, for example. I don't think I have to convince Nancy Holder that there are things that she can learn from television, and that film and television can be artistic mediums. She writes fantastic things. For those of you who haven't read Nancy's book, she's amazing, and she writes her own original brilliant horror, but she also writes movie novelizations and things like that. So she's multi-talented, and that's awesome. But okay, so why can those of us in pop fic potentially have an easier time with this? Well, partly we tend to consume multimedia things. We're used to seeing what we like change from medium to medium. We've seen comic books made into movies. We've seen television shows made into books. We've seen books made into everything. And we're generally comfortable with this. When we go to our big nerd events, there's usually multimedia representation there. Also, the rant. If you guys have heard me at any point at Stonecoast, you've probably heard my rant, which is, so maybe the real reason why I'm making this presentation is because I have a chip on my shoulder. Because, like I said, I write magic realism a lot of the time, and so literary people are like, oh, that's almost literary enough for me. And that's kind of an awkward line to ride, and to try to convince people I don't need to be in the literary camp to be taken seriously as an artist. I mean, we have some seriously amazing artists in our popular fiction world. And I think that there's a big bias against that. And people, when they think of genre fiction, a lot of times they think of popcorn entertainment. And like, first of all, I want to say popcorn entertainment actually serves a really important role. It's very difficult to do well. And even if you think you write really highly artistic things, I think it's valuable to see what you can learn from popcorn entertainment as well. So I'm not disparaging that at all, but I know that if I'm trying to convince people to take something seriously, we should look at things that are more serious, more artistic. And so I tend to use, like, for example, Ursula K. Le Guin as an example when I'm trying to convince people that popular fiction, science fiction, and fantasy can ask big questions. It can tackle things in a way that you can't in realistic fiction without risking alienating your audience. If you have a real-world social justice issue, you're going to shut off people who are already opposed to you. But if you suddenly make it about aliens, then it can be a little bit easier for people to digest and think about and not get defensive. And it gives like a safe place to play with topics. So that's one of the main benefits of science fiction and fantasy. That's like historically one of the things that many of the greats do. And I think that we can all agree that that's what great literature should do, whether it has aliens or elves or just normal people going about their daily lives. So that's my rant. Congratulations, that's the like condensed version of it. But okay, so we're gonna start with looking for things that have artistic merit in mediums we might not normally think of that way. So we're going to start with something that I think is easy. Okay, first of all, did anybody actually read or watch Persepolis? Okay, how many of you read Persepolis? How many of you watched Persepolis? Those of you who read Persepolis, why did you choose to read it instead of watch it?
Because I already owned it. I already owned it.
You already owned it? That's a good reason. Anybody else have any reasons they want to give?
I like graphic novels. It's probably going back to the bias.
Okay. How many of you, so those of you who chose to watch the movie, why did you watch the movie? It's faster. It's over in 2 hours, so you don't have to do anything. Did any of you watch the movie because you don't read comic books? No? Okay, good. I was wondering whether that was going to be a thing, or whether that was going to be a thing that people owned up to, because it's something that I've heard people be a little bit uncomfortable with, because it is a comic book, and people are like, I don't read comic books. Why would I read a comic book? But it is. Persepolis is a comic book. For those of you who don't know what Persepolis is, it is an Iranian woman who grew up during the Iranian Revolution, writing about her experience with her family, how that affected her. She goes to France to get away from it, and kind of breaks down both like the social issues of the time and her personal issues, and it's this incredibly, incredibly powerful work. It's beautiful. So here, is it a movie or is it a film? It won a number of awards, or was nominated for a number of awards as an independent film. Is it a comic book, or is it a graphic novel, or is it both? Is it an autobiographical text? Yes. Can it be used as a primary source in a research paper, an academic research paper? I have done it. I've presented a paper that I wrote at a conference with this as a primary source, along with all of my words on page based primary sources, because that's what it is. It is one woman sharing her personal experience during a historical period. Does it have artistic merit? I think it is hard to argue that Persepolis does not have artistic merit. It is a beautiful, touching, moving piece. It's an insight into the human condition. So from this, we can then conclude that we may have these biases. We may say, I hate comic books because they're stupid superhero stories that are juvenile for children. But comic books can also be Persepolis. And they can be so much more. So we've kind of looked at an animated movie, a comic book, and said these can deal with real issues. These are serious, these are valuable, these are artistic. Persepolis does not exist as the sole example. So this man interviewed his father, who was a Holocaust survivor, and made a comic book about it. And there are reasons why he chose to make a comic book, why the people are mice. Again, if you make it a little bit separated from the real world experience, it is safer to do very difficult and dangerous things. And it is safer for people to consume difficult and dangerous things. Moving to animated movies. Actually, okay, so has anyone read Mouse? Okay, yes. Has anybody watched Grave of the Fireflies? Okay, so this is an animated movie, it's beautiful, about 2 children slowly starving to death in the aftermath of World War II in Japan. It is not a very happy movie, but it is really beautiful and thought-provoking. And then to have something that's not entirely depressing? Not entirely depressing, because it is a little bit, but if I put this in front of you guys, those of you who've seen Up, you probably have emotions that kind of get stirred up in you, because the first section of Up is one of the most beautifully presented love stories and life stories I have ever seen in my life. And to give you an idea of how powerful it is, the first time I saw it, I was on a plane watching someone else watch it. So there was no audio, and it was like over there, and I couldn't take my eyes away, and I could tell what was happening, and I was crying on the plane without any of the audio cues, without any dialogue, without anything, without even knowing the context, because it's so powerful and beautiful. And it does it like a lot of the storytelling is largely without words, and it's really, I don't know, it's something that we could learn from, like why is Up so powerful, and how can we work that power into our own fiction? These are questions that I'm asking myself. So television shows, again, I'm not a television person. This is mostly a matter of time. I don't have a problem with television, but the only show I keep up with is Steven Universe, which is 10 minutes long. So this is mostly going off of what other people talk about or history. Okay, so Jessica Jones has led to national conversations about PTSD, trauma, consent, assault, abuse, really important, heavy issues. I cannot watch Jessica Jones, because if I did, I know that I would be traumatized and have nightmares, because it's powerful. But the fact that we're having those conversations because of this superhero show, I think really reflects that it is dealing with some important social issues of our time. And having conversations that we need to have. And so conversations that are still relevant today, but that were very relevant back in the day, the first interracial kiss on television. This is a big deal. And Star Trek has always kind of pushed the envelope towards acceptance. Gene Roddenberry had a very optimistic view of human nature, and he was like, if only we could get to what I think that humans are capable of. And it's this very loving and beautiful idea, which I think is really good and powerful, to think we could overcome racism, we can overcome classism, we can get to a point where everybody embraces and loves everyone else. Whether you're convinced of that or not, it is a beautiful sentiment. And it's, for all that Star Trek is very campy, especially the original series, it does have that at its heart, and that's really valuable and important. So Also, this moment, like I said, very important. So here's the reason why probably some of you guys are here. Here's the biggest, most difficult one to argue. So there are video games, if you don't play video games, you think it's just about shooting people. There are a lot of games that are about shooting people, but a lot of games aren't. And a lot of games are also directly addressing the idea of shooting people and why that is why fighting and violence is the default idea when it comes to making video games. So I've decided to pick some of the more artistic ones. Those of you who play games might be familiar with some of my examples. So, Gone Home is an independent game made by a small indie studio in which you take on the role of and I'm going to actually explain a little bit about these games because I'm assuming that enough of you don't know them, and this is, again, the tough sell part of my presentation. In Gone Home, it's a game where you walk around, you pick things up, you look at them, you trigger dialogue, you discover little hidden things. And the story of it is that you are a college kid, a girl, who's come home from studying abroad to find that your house is empty. Your family is not there. And there are no notes, no indication of exactly where they are. They didn't leave a note that says, "Hi, we'll be back from the store in half an hour." So you're wandering around this abandoned, dark, creepy house in the middle of a thunderstorm trying to figure out what happened. Spoiler? Everybody okay if I spoil a little bit about Gone Home? Okay, so what's actually happened in your family is you have this it's set in the 90s, and you have a very conservative family with a lot of problems, and your younger sister is a lesbian. And you kind of discover her self-discovery through her notes because she's very close to the sister, so she's left notes for you, the narrator. And so the narrator comments on the things that you find. She'll pick it up and think about things. Or she'll get these notes from her sister, and you'll get kind of an audio played. And the writing and the voice acting are very high quality. But it's this self-discovery as you begin to realize the unraveling of your family and your sister's attempt to run away from home so that she can have the freedom to be herself. And it's powerful, it's beautiful, it's well written, it is hilarious because you've got these really snarky, really smart teenagers. But it has to be done in an interactive medium. This experience would not be the same if you read it in a book. Because, we've all probably read coming of age, coming out stories. And whether you read the sister's story, like the narrator, the older sister's story, or the younger sister's story, it wouldn't be the same as you walking through, looking at things, discovering the story at your own pace, getting involved in the multimedia experience of the music, the sound, the visuals. Everything comes together to make this experience that makes you feel like the older sister. And it makes you think about these issues. And in some cases, it makes you a little nostalgic for the 90s. In some cases, it doesn't. But it's a very serious piece. It was very controversial when it came out in the game community because people are like, is it enough of a game because I'm not shooting things? It is, it's not for everyone. And of course, there were some people who objected to the subject matter, which in my opinion indicates that the subject matter is important and we should continue to have things like this. So that's Gone Home. If you don't play video games and you want to play an artistic video game, this one is not hard. It will play on your computer. It is beautiful. I think that it is actually well written and that its dialogue and voice acting hold up, even as a writer, not just as a gamer. So I would recommend Gone Home. You don't have to be a gamer to play it. Here's one. Did you guys hear the beautiful cello music we were listening to when we first came in here? It's the soundtrack to Journey, one of the most artistic games ever made. Another game that doesn't have violence in it. And what is really powerful about Journey, again, spoilers, is that you are this mysterious creature going on this mysterious journey, and you are joined by somebody, you are paired with a random other person who is playing the game. You cannot speak to each other. You can only communicate by running around each other, and you can beep. You can like beep, 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 beep. So you can it's amazing how much communication you can do. If you circle someone and you beep and you run off, and then you run back and you beep and you run off, and you do that enough times, they'll eventually be like, oh, you want me to follow you. And it's that moment of communication. It's like when you wave somebody on, and then you're driving, and you have that nonverbal communication, and you're like, yes, shared humanity, this is powerful. Maybe that's just me. I really enjoy that. But there's a lot of that in Journey, and it gets to the point where you start getting reliant. So as the game gets scarier and scarier, you are with this other person. And when I played the game, in the scariest part of the game, I was playing with somebody who was very nervous. And I could tell they were nervous from the way they were acting. And I'd never played the game before, but they thought I knew what I was doing. And by God, I was not going to let them down. So I was like, all right, you follow me. I'm going to do this. And then after the scary part, you get separated. And you are devastated. And you don't know this person. And there's no dialogue. And you only have the general idea of what the context of the story is. But you are alone. And you feel that loneliness. And it's powerful. And it's beautiful. And then you find your friend again. And you're just like, yes. And I've talked to so many people who have had this profound experience. And yes, it is beautiful. And the soundtrack is amazing. But it also really makes us think about how we can connect to people if we put aside our ability to call other humans names. Because that's a lot of what interacting on the internet is like, and that's why you can't talk. Because if you can talk in it, people will be their worst selves. But if you expect people to be their best selves, they might just rise to it. And in Journey, they do. So unfortunately, this is on the PlayStation 3 or PlayStation 4. So unless you live with a gamer, if you're a non-gamer, this would be a bit more of an investment than Gone Home. But it's a really powerful experience. And then this, I promise I didn't just make this so that I could talk about Undertale. I really like this game. Those of you who know me online know that I like Undertale. But so what is different about Undertale compared to these other games? Again, this is not one that I would recommend for non-gamers, but for those of us who've played video games in which the default assumption is that you're going to fight monsters, in this, you can fight the monsters. You can kill the monsters. You can kill every single monster, but every single monster in the game is a person with a name, with a personality, with a relationship to others. And you can play through the entire game, and it's a bit more challenging, but you can play through the entire game without killing anything. And that is a conscious choice that you have to make. And by making you make that choice, I mean, first of all, if you do kill somebody, you kind of feel bad about it because the game kind of is like, hey, why did you do that? You just murdered someone. And you're like, oh, I did. Like, there's a character early on that you can kill. And the number of my friends who went and played the game and then came to me and they were crying and they were like, Lauren, did I have to kill that person? Because I feel so bad. Because on some level you should. If you're thinking about it not just as wish fulfillment, but if you're thinking about what you're choosing to do with your free time, at least acknowledge that you are choosing to play games in which you shoot people. And Undertale kind of makes you consider that by giving you the option. And that's very powerful. And you can play through the entire game and get one ending if you don't kill anybody. If you kill everybody, you get a different game or a different ending. And there are people, and when you beat the game in a good way, they tell you don't beat the game in the bad way. And a lot of people do anyway. And I'm like, that's a choice, and that's a choice I'm not making. And that's really powerful, I think, to have the ability to choose how you interact with this, because it's easy, like, oh, it's just a video game. What difference does it make? Well, it's just a video game, so it's easy not to do that. So you see these questions, they have me thinking about choice, they have me thinking about violence, they have me thinking about pacifism. And it's this hilarious, funny, weird, quirky game with really well-developed characters and some of the wittiest humor I've ever encountered. But it has at its heart that really powerful core, and it has really, really resonated with a lot of people. I'm not the only crazy fangirl. But I am a crazy fangirl, so let me tell you about Undertale. But so here's the thing though, even if these things don't make my list, there's still something you can learn from them. Just like you can learn from badly written books, just like you can learn from things outside your genre, there are things you can learn from these different art forms, because they are art forms and they deserve to be appreciated as such. So how? I've kind of ranted at you guys about the why, but how is it that we can learn from these things? Because they're not prose fiction, they're not going to follow the exact formats that we're used to. So here's our list. Again, we're just doing these three because these are the three that I chose to talk about. We could talk all day. Maybe we will talk about other things because we're going to have time to talk. But so how do we learn by example? Okay, so dialogue. How many of us write dialogue in the things that we write? Does anybody here not write dialogue? Excellent, good. Okay, so one of the biggest challenges in writing dialogue is how do you make it sound, if you're going to do this, how do you make it sound natural without making it natural? Because we don't want to include the ums, you don't want to include the uhs, you don't want to include the tangents and the rambling and the missed flubbed words and the changing verb tenses partway through sentence. All of these things that we do every day that if you just took direct dictation of what people said and you put that on the page, it wouldn't work very well. But you also, unless you're choosing to make stylized dialogue, you don't want to make it sound stilted and weird either. So how do you walk that line? Who does that more than people who write for film? Because dialogue that's the only words on the page that they have. And so it has to be delivered well, it has to be written well. And we've all heard badly written dialogue, well acted, and well-written dialogue, badly acted. And so you can really kind of get a sense for what good dialogue is and how it works. And how do people create those scenes and those stories when so much of what you're experiencing is that. It's a great way to kind of tune your ear and see how other people solve problems. Plays do the same thing, but I don't think anybody argues that plays aren't literature. So they're on here because I'm acknowledging them, but I don't think I have to rant at you guys about them. But let's see. Maybe make sure that I didn't miss anything. I've been kind of going without my notes. No, I think I'm doing all right. Oh, and then there's another thing you can learn about stylized dialogue. Like the Coen brothers don't write realistic dialogue. They write stylized dialogue. I don't like it, but a lot of people do. And if you're thinking, how do people write with a style? How do you write dialogue with a style that's distinctive to you? Look at the Coen brothers. See how they pull that off. You don't have to write like the Coen brothers, but you can kind of see how their personality and their style works its way into their movies, and maybe find a way to make your own style work into your own writing. So expanding your toolbox. Okay, so I came to Stone Coast to learn to write novels because I usually write short stories. It's a very different animal. And you can't even treat it like a bunch of individual short stories. That doesn't work because you've got to have this overarching plot. Episodic television does that all the time, badly and well. I love Star Trek The Next Generation. I really do, but its A plots and B plots are very parallel. They're very predictable. They're too related. It's like, hey, if you didn't get A plot, B plot is here to punch you in the face about it. So, as an example of what not to do, because you have to have A plots, B plots, C plots, probably D and E plots if you're writing a novel. So again, I like science fiction. Babylon 5 has this very big, very serious overarching plot, which you don't even see coming at first, because it's so mired in like the character stories, and they've all got conflicts. And you'll have episodes even later on that are just about that character, but the writers are always thinking, how is the big overarching plot moving? How are the bad guys approaching? And so you might forget about it briefly, but they never do, and then they'll pull it in, and you're like, oh, right! And that was hinted at in that other episode that was just about this personal drama. And that's really cool. How do they do that? I don't know. I need to watch more Babylon 5 and learn from that. I can also read books, but that's a good way of specifically looking at that. Also, it's entertaining television. And so other things, I'm a very navel-gazy writer. I just have my characters like just thinking, I've got feelings, I've got feelings. So having to be a more visual writer is good. And a good challenge is to ask yourself, how do I write exclusively from the outside as though this were visual medium? Film, television, comic books. Comic books have a lot of things that film does with a camera angle, what you show in the frame, that sort of thing. When you start thinking like that, you can bring that into your writing, which if you're like me, is really helpful. And then finally, something that you can do in comic books more easily than anything else is you can change what you put on the page to make a point. Like suddenly flowers appear behind the love interest, and we're like, oh, I see. Those of you who read shoujo comics, you know. And it's not realistic, but it kind of makes a point. How would you put that into fiction? I don't know, but I bet people are doing it, and I bet that we could expand our own abilities if we thought about that. I mean, why not consider that as a challenge? How do we take something that is nothing like what we do, that is nothing like the prose on the page, and try to have that strengthen our prose on the page? I don't know. It's interesting. And then, okay, so cliches and understanding your genre. Okay, so people these days, some of them read books, some of them don't. Some of them read books and other things. Most of them watch movies, a lot of them watch television. Some of them read comic books, and a lot of them play video games. So whatever you create, especially in popular fiction, but not just in popular fiction, people are consuming these mediums already. You are not writing into a vacuum. So what you create, again, this is kind of about, I guess, cultural awareness. If you think that you've got this great new idea that nobody's talked about before, and all of your readers have already played a game or watched a movie that had that idea, you're kind of counting on something that isn't there. So if you're familiar with what they're familiar with, then you kind of know, and you can kind of engage in dialogue with what's already been created, just as you would with fiction. Because you're not just competing with fiction, you're not just building on fiction, all this other stuff exists too. So I think that it is a good idea to be educated, because it's also kind of embarrassing. It's like in genre, sometimes we'll have non-genre people come stomping on the flowers in genre and say, look, I have this great idea and it's brand new, and we're like, guys, we've been doing that for 40 years. So you don't want to be that person. Then Ursula K. Le Guin makes fun of you in essays, and you don't want to be the person Ursula K. Le Guin makes fun of in essays. I know I talk about her a lot. She's amazing. If you haven't read her, you should. I think that it is good for you. Like for me, I'm writing a cyberpunk novel with sentient androids, and it is a good thing that I have watched Star Trek and played Mass Effect and things, because the people who read my book are going to. And on another tangent, I'm writing a young adult novel, and I'm writing a young adult novel for people who are probably a bit more socially conscious. The people who read my book are going to be the people who play Undertale and watch Steven Universe, which if you haven't, and I didn't get a picture of Steven Universe, I'm sorry, but Steven Universe is this cartoon that has one of the most diverse casts I've ever seen, one of the most diverse voice acting casts I've ever seen. And the kids that are going to be reading my book are going to expect representation. They're going to expect diversity. They're going to expect something that reflects the world, that reflects them. And if I just kind of tra-la-la-la and I don't know that that's actually happening, that change is actually happening, I mean, I'm not going to connect with them, and I'm not going to be as good a person or as good a writer as I should be. So there are not just the awareness of the what is being created creatively for like the worlds and the monsters and the aliens and the story elements, but also this kind of thing. It's really important to know what is going on in the world around you. So then there's a bonus, which you notice wasn't on my initial list, but So I have another rant about the short fiction genre market, which is that a lot of times the slush readers, which are the people who read the first submissions, get really jaded, and they want things that aren't like other stories, and so they kind of get this more and more and more esoteric, strange, breaking with fiction where you have like the story written vertically, that's vertical, right? This is horizontal? Okay, good. And I'm not joking, that happened in publication, and it kind of runs off readers. And I think that it kind of forgets why we do what we do, which is not just to impress each other, but to connect with other people. So if you bring in new blood, you bring in new ideas, you will make your own writing healthier, and you also make your community healthier, because instead of pulling from the same places, instead of the same inspiration, and things all being alike, you are bringing in things that are from outside, and that's almost always good for a community. So how does this relate to my writing, which actually, this is the last part I put in my presentation. I was like, oh, maybe I can get away without talking about my stuff, but it was right there in my presentation description, so it's here. So again, I told you guys I'm writing a cyberpunk space opera story, science fiction, for young adults. So this is the aesthetic of my novel. If you come on Friday and you hear me read it, this is from Shadowrun. Has anybody here, has anyone ever played a Shadowrun game? Excellent, somebody has. Okay, it's specifically the 1980s style. Cyberpunk has a very, very gritty feel. And as I was working on my novel, I was like, oh, maybe it could, I mean, Alex read like an earlier version, and I was trying to do this like weird 1950s thing with it that it wasn't working at all, because I was like, what should I be doing to be taken seriously as literature? But really, he was like, what do you want to do? And I was like, I wanted to be cyberpunk. And he was like, then make it cyberpunk. It's cyberpunk. And it's this really cool, exciting thing, and it's a visual medium. And granted, Shadowrun is actually a role-playing series, but there's a lot of visual stuff that accompanies it, and that's what I drew inspiration from. And it is much easier to draw inspiration for a setting for me from visuals that I can look at and say, that's what it looks like, that's what it feels like, that's what it sounds like, that's what it smells like. Whereas if I'm reading other people's books, it's harder to visualize it, and then it's harder for me to write about it. So for me, that's helpful. So thank you, Shadowrun. But then, like, okay, I was just gonna get a still, but then I found Data with Spot, and I figured this way you can all appreciate how adorable he is. So these are things both good and bad that the content of my novel that I've drawn some inspiration from. So we've got Mega Man X in the corner. Mega Man X is not a story-driven game. It is so badly written, it is hilarious. But kind of by accident, the fourth game asks a really big question. We have these sentient androids, and they're like, hey, we are being told by the humans to go kill each other and make order, but we kind of want to go make our own country and be our own people and have our own freedom. And then you're told, as the hero of the story, nah, just go shoot those guys, they're rebels, they're bad. And I'm like, wait a minute, what? Because I was like, did you guys not realize that you just asked this very important question? So they did it really badly, but that's a question that I'm trying to answer with my novel. Mass Effect, again, I actually think that the writing in Mass Effect, controversial opinion, it's very hit or miss. But it does ask a lot of questions about artificial intelligences, and if they achieve sentience, do you give them personhood, or are they incapable of being sentient, and we should continue to treat them as things? Which has real-world overtones as well. And so that's a question that I'm interested in exploring. Babylon 5, like I've said, I really like the way that they have the overarching plot and the very, very, very character-driven stuff. Lieutenant Data at the bottom, I love him. He's another, as you can tell, there's a lot of questions in my novel about sentience and personhood and freedom. And they deal with that a lot with him, and he's kind of more human than the humans in a lot of ways. I mean, he desperately wants to feel like a human being, but I mean, he loves his cat. He really loves his cat. He doesn't know if it counts as love. Does it count as love? That's a good question. And then Metropolis. Has anyone here seen Fritz Lang's Metropolis? Yes! I love that movie. It's a silent film. And it, I think more than anything, is the inspiration for a lot of my novel, because I tell people that my novel is kind of like 1980s cyberpunk Shadowrun stuff meets Mega Man X meets Charles Dickens. And Metropolis kind of gets a bit of that class disparity, the haves and have-nots, and the kind of war between that when you start treating people, dehumanizing people. There's a lot of dehumanization in my novel. Also, Metropolis is gorgeous, and there's a version of the soundtrack that is Queen music, and it's great. If you haven't seen it, I would recommend it. It is a really great work of film. Notice that word. But yeah, so these things are all very inspiring to me. In some cases for the visual elements, in some cases for the story elements, in some cases for what's done well, in some cases for what's done poorly. But this makes, I think, for me, a much richer story experience than if I was just pulling from like Joan Vinge and William Gibson and things like that. which, I mean, don't get me wrong, I do draw inspiration from that sort of thing, and Ursula K. Le Guin, because she's amazing. But I think that the fact that I have multimedia inspiration is both going to help me connect to a larger audience, which for at least genre writers and pop fic writers is important. But I think that even people who are writing literary fiction want an audience. And so this kind of, I can speak the language of those people. But I also just think, like, as far as the artistic merit of my work, it is stronger for having considered what works and what doesn't work on a broader field. So here's the part where we talk, where you talk. So how does this relate to your writing? One of the assignments, so Jim gave me some really good advice. He was like, make it a controversial topic so people will sit there, and then don't assign much reading, and people might come to your presentations. So the reading for my presentation, Persepolis, because who doesn't want to experience Persepolis? If you haven't read or watched Persepolis, do yourself a favor. It's gorgeous, it's powerful, you might cry, you'll be changed, you'll be moved, it's great. But the other part of it, which is the part where you don't have to do any reading, you don't really have to do any work except thinking, is think of 3 things that are not words on page, fiction or poetry, that are relevant to what you write, that you could learn from or draw inspiration from. Has anybody done that? Including the people I strong-armed into doing it? All right, go for it.